right, so yes, I'm here to talk about creating inclusive digital spaces through information architecture. If you don't know what information architecture is, don't worry, there's a definition in here. But this is me, I'm Clair, information architect. My pronouns are they, them, theirs, and that's what I look like. And I also work for a company called Logic Dept. Logic Dept is a small female-owned Brooklyn-based business. We work with nonprofits who have too many websites or too many web pages. They don't know what to do with what they've got, and we help them consolidate it and make their web presence more productive. So quick definitions before we get started in the actual part of the presentation. So information architecture is the way that we arrange the parts of something to make them understandable. This can look like alphabetical cross-referencing, links in website navigation, labels, how content is organized in a brochure. Pretty much anything where there's content, information architecture has played a part in how that content looks. And for this essentially case study that we're talking about through today, we'll be discussing links and website navigation. Just a few more definitions before we get started. This conversation that we're having today is a lot about the transgender population, so we're just going through some language that I'll be using. So the first definition is cis or cisgender. This is a word that describes a person whose sense of gender identity matches that of the sex that they were assigned at birth. Next we have trans or transgender. This is an umbrella term that broadly covers any person whose gender identity differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. And then finally, folx, spelled with an X. This is an alternative spelling to folks spelled with a KS. That is a gender and culturally inclusive term to address a group of people. So you will hear this language throughout, just so you know. So, January of this year, my boss looked at me, we were not very busy at work, and she said, "Claire, do you want to do something that helps the trans community?" I kind of thought about it for a little while. I didn't really know what to do. I felt like I couldn't really do anything with information architecture to help my community, but I, thought, and I could, and I did it. This is that project. So, to do that project, I had to come up with some research goals. So there they are, research goals. So, I wanted to find a website that I could kind of overhaul. So before I did that, research goals to make them more productive. The first research goal that I had was how to make sensitive content inclusive to multiple audiences with very different backgrounds and entry points. And my second research goal, which is kind of the bigger one, was to help the trans community through improvements to a specific website by neutralizing the language and in turn normalizing the population. This way. Much better. Sorry. All right. So with those research goals in mind, I spent a lot of time looking at websites, so many websites, and I landed on this one. This is the National Center for Transgender Equality. So this organization is offering a lot of really great content. They do a lot of legal stuff for the trans community to make sure that we're treated properly and that everything doesn't suck. But their website, however, is less than beautiful. Not just from a design standpoint, from an information architecture standpoint as well. So this website, the reason that I was really drawn to it is I had this kind of idea that like if a parent has a child who has recently come out as trans and they're trying to find resources on how they can help their child and be supportive of their child, maybe they're doing research, maybe they land on this website and they find good content, they find this like about transgender people, but it's right next to a label called issues. So you have this super informative information, this like great supportive information, right next to a really negative word that could immediately turn someone off. This section does cover like good issues. It covers like potential health risks of being on hormone replacement therapy, legal issues, these types of things. But the word issue is immediately going to turn someone off. So this was the website that I decided to focus my research on. So, and looking into it, my multiple audiences that I wanted to focus on, looked through the website, looked at all the content that was there, and these are the audiences that I realized they were serving. Trans folks, advocates of the LGBTQ plus community, and folks from outside of the LGBTQ plus community. So to do my research, I did something called card sorting. Does anybody here know what card sorting is?
Yeah.
Ooh, that's more than I've ever seen, cool. So card sorting is a method of research used to understand the organization of content on a website. So what happens is you give participants a group of cards or topics and you have them sort them into groups that make sense to them. kind of like I would expect to see all of these things together. And then they label that group with a title that makes sense to them as well. So these things go together, and if I were on a website, I imagine I'd find it under this label. This is how they do that. So that is the research that I did for this project. And I conducted 2 different types of card sorts for this. I conducted moderated card sorts, which were allowed me to interact with the participant as they were doing the card sort. I was able to ask them questions, get a deeper understanding of why they were sorting cards a certain way, try to understand what certain cards meant to them, just really get like the nitty-gritty knowledge about what they were looking at and how they were experiencing it. And then I also conducted unmoderated card sorts. So the unmoderated card sorts, I had a link, I just sent it out on the internet. Please do this thing, I said. And this was mostly done to kind of confirm or deny the research findings from my moderated card sorts. And that kind of worked, but kind of did not. We'll get into it. So before I get into the actual results of the research, I just want to talk about some considerations for stigmatized audiences. This is specifically when it comes to doing research and different types of research. So, if you've ever done recruitment before, you know that it's awful. No one wants to click on your link. That can be especially difficult with stigmatized audiences, underserved populations. So, luckily enough, as a trans person, I was like, I have these groups that I can go to, and I had these safe outreach channels that I was able to use to get a wider breadth reach of my community. So, if you're doing research with underserved populations, try and find these communities, make sure you introduce yourself in a good way, and see if you can't access these communities through safe outreach channels. I also used internal advocates. So I really did have a lot of trouble recruiting trans folks for this research, which I thought was super interesting because I was like, hi, me too. But there's been this issue that's kind of plaguing the trans community right now, where there's a lot of tokenizing. Everybody wants to take a picture of a trans person. So people want to know who you are, what you're doing, and why you're doing this research, and they just do not trust anybody who's trying to reach the community. So I worked with some internal advocates. I have friends who have bigger voices than I do. I have a friend who works at Glisten, and they were able to kind of vouch for me and say Claire's doing this research and it's good, and actually please do it. So if you have an opportunity to work with an internal advocate, or you have someone that can vouch for you when you're trying to reach these populations, don't be afraid to ask. And finally, obviously most importantly, safety, confidentiality, and anonymity. These are always important when you're doing research, but when you're working with underserved populations or stigmatized audiences, they're extremely important. For the safety of myself, when I was doing this research, the moderated sessions were all remote, so I was using Zoom. I wasn't in a room with these people. Some of this recruitment was done randomly, so I didn't know who I was going to be sitting down with. So that's for my safety, and also for the safety of the other people. They could leave at any time, they didn't have to stay there. And confidentiality and anonymity, everything's randomized. All the files have since been destroyed. They were saved on a local drive while we were doing them. These things are incredibly important, especially when you're reaching out to these underserved populations, stigmatized communities, because they're more concerned about their own personal safety and who might see them on this thing. So you really need to consider this when you're doing research. Also, we came into some really interesting findings with the moderated sessions. As a trans person, I was talking to trans people, and we were having very funny conversations. Beneficial to the research, but there was a rapport there. There was a comfortability that I was able to have different conversations with the trans folks. One person even said, "Do you know a trans? Would you like to know a trans? Are you a cis? Click here." And then they made a group called Trans 101. So that's kind of this comfortability. It was more of a conversation, more of learning from a similar experience. And then on the flip side of that, we had really timid and hesitant responses from folks from outside of the LGBTQ plus community specifically. We had some really long sessions here where people were super concerned about hurting my feelings and had a lot to say and wanted to ask a million questions and talk about a million things. One person did something like this, where they just kind of went back and forth, and they said, "Within my own lack of knowledge, I don't want to group anything that might be particularly insensitive, so I'm thinking really carefully about everything." So with research, especially with card sorts, when you get somebody who's thinking and overthinking and thinking and thinking and thinking, it can be less than productive, because then you're not getting that immediate like off the cuff response that like, I see this goes together, here we go. So we got really interesting results from that. So, moderate decisions. And also finally, just when it comes to doing research with stigmatized populations, be sure to use care. As I mentioned earlier, be sure to consider the safety of your moderators and participants. These sessions were all done remotely for my safety and other people's safety. If you can, it's important to work with members of the community to boost your reach and trust. There's been plenty of research done that teams who are super diverse are more, there's a word I'm losing here, they work better. So diverse teams are smarter, they have more productivity, there we go. So if you have a diverse team to start with, you're already gonna be able to have more access to more communities. And also, if you have the possibility, even though it's usually a financial strain, conduct both moderated and unmoderated research. And also, finally, when it comes to doing research, obviously be inclusive. Avoid stigmatized language and labeling. We're gonna really dive into this here in a minute, because this will automatically alienate whole populations of people if you're using language that just immediately excludes certain audiences. And when you're doing research, ensure that your research methods and tools are inclusive as well, because you can use the language, but if your research methods, your surveys aren't using that language, people are getting a mixed message. When we do research at Logic Department, when we have to ask gender, if we have to ask gender, we do not just ask male, female, and other. We ask male, female, non-binary, third gender, prefer not to answer, and then other with a field so they can fill out whatever they would like. Most research tools don't allow you to change the word other, but if you have the option, I would recommend changing it to something along the lines of another option we haven't considered, because the word other says, hey, you're another thing and you don't matter. So if you have the possibility, change that. So finally, research findings from this project that I did. So as I said earlier, I was trying to find a website that had multiple audiences with different understandings, and I did that. So from my research, I had these 3 different audiences that were looking at this content in very different ways. We had really detailed and nuanced responses from the trans folks to really high-level and non-specific responses from folks from outside the LGBTQ plus community. I'm going to dive into each one of these groups really quick and just kind of talk about what we found from each one of them, but it was definitely an interesting spread that we got here. So the first audience is trans folks. So trans folks, as I mentioned earlier, we were having a lot of conversation. They were looking at things very differently than the other audiences. They were seeing the minute details, things that the other audiences were definitely missing. There was a topic that was passport, and all the other groups were like, traveling, no. Trans folks were looking at this and saying, yeah, I do need to update my gender marker on my passport. I need to update my name. So they're immediately seeing these tiny details that the other audiences are missing, and they're able to make more groups with that knowledge. We did see a little bit of othering language from the trans folks, which was pretty interesting. That Trans 101, that group that we saw earlier, that's immediately kind of like an othering tone. 101 doesn't necessarily mean anything to people outside of America, doesn't mean anything to people that haven't been to college, and it says like, hey, duh, you should know this, which immediately kind of sends off a negative vibe. The next audience group that we had was advocates. So advocates are super dedicated to learning and knowing as much as they can about whatever it is that they're advocating for. So they're coming in, they also have this like really detailed knowledge about the thing that they're, about the topics that they were looking at here, but it wasn't quite as detailed as the trans folks. So we did see a lot of groups and a lot of interesting information from the advocates. And they're also super dedicated to making sure that everyone is educated on the thing that they're advocating for and can understand what they're advocating for. Within that, we saw a lot of neutral language from the advocates. So a lot of language that was just kind of like white bread. Everybody can see it and understand what they're looking at. The last audience that we had was folks from outside of the LGBTQ plus community. So interestingly, with this audience, we saw very different results from the moderated sessions and the unmoderated sessions. From the moderated sessions, as I mentioned earlier, we had pretty long sessions. We heard a lot of outright statements about lack of knowledge. People were very, very concerned about hurting my feelings. Every single one of these sessions was so long. But it was okay, I got a lot of good information. So we had this like safety issue where it was like, I don't want to hurt your feelings. And we had that within that, there was this really odd desire to make all of the groups that they were organizing all-encompassing. So they were just like shoving everything together and being like, yep, that goes together. But on the flip side, from the unmoderated sessions, we had a lot of othering language. It was totally different results from the moderated sessions. This group of folks from outside of the LGBTQ plus community really saw this content as issues that didn't affect them. Everything was like LGBTQ plus this, LGBTQ plus that. Everybody needs healthcare, everybody has to go to the doctor, but for them it was LGBTQ plus health. So, within all of that was weird. These are the section titles that we got from our findings from all three audiences. The top, that light blue, is the trans folks, gold is the advocates, and the dark blue is folks from outside the LGBTQ plus community. So, with this labeling, these are like navigation labels. So within this, we looked at all of these labels, we found the patterns in the card sort results, and we decided to make recommendations to the National Center for Transgender Equality on how to make their website more neutral, but also inclusive. So we went through these and we chose these things. First, we chose health and wellness, again, because LGBTQ plus health is immediately othering a portion of the population that doesn't need to be othered necessarily. Yes, there are some health concerns that LGBTQ plus folks deal with that are not necessarily in the realm of other people's health, but it's all healthcare. Everybody needs a physical. Everybody has to go to the doctor. There's no need to use an othering label on that. So we recommended health and wellness for this section. The next section we have is rights and legal. So trans folks and advocates really interestingly broke this section up into two different sections, which was like this government kind of rights stuff and then the law. The folks from outside the LGBTQ plus community kept this content together, which we felt was really important. Not only is the label itself really neutral and says exactly what's in this section, it also puts all of that content together. So this could be really important, especially right now since we're in voting time. Trans folks have a lot of trouble at the polls. They need to know that they have the right to vote, no matter if their ID has a different gender on it than their gender presentation, and then they can know the legal ramifications and how they can handle that from a legal side, all in the same space. Next we have youth and students, which only one group made, which is a problem. Super important. We definitely decided to recommend this section because youth and students, especially trans kids, have a lot of trouble right now in schools, and so having a section where people can come and learn how they can support their children or their schools, make their schools more inclusive, they can find this content here. But this label in itself isn't exclusively saying, this is for trans kids. It just says this is for youth, this is for students. Housing, IDs and documents. So IDs and documents, this is what we were talking about earlier with the passport. So the trans folks were seeing all of this content about updating documents. This is like immigration documents, driver's licenses, passports, these types of things. And the other audiences were seeing travel, which doesn't necessarily make sense, but whatever. But we did, within that, if they hadn't chose travel as a word, the label ID and IDs and documents is already neutral and inclusive. For example, if someone were to just get married and decide to change their last name, they also need to know how to update their passport and their driver's license. They could land on this website for some reason and find this section labeled IDs and documents and learn how to update their last name. So it's inclusive to anybody that might land on this section. Next, this is actually my favorite section. We went with learning and support from the advocates. So this label is doing exactly what advocates want to do. It's encouraging people to learn about this population, encouraging people to support this population. And it's just encouraging people to do that with this label that's not necessarily saying like, learn about this population or duh, you should know this stuff. It's doing it in like a gentle but like, hey, learn about this kind of way. And next we have advocacy. So trans folks were looking at excuse me, trans folks were looking at this content and seeing it as resources for themselves, how they can work and survive in the world, and advocates were seeing this and definitely seeing these are advocacy tools for anyone to look at and take away with and learn how to support the trans community. And finally, we have LGBTQ plus in the military. So I know we've been talking about not using other language, but in this case, when this research was being done, there was a lot of issues going on with trans folks in the military. So this was a hot ticket item. People were really looking for this content. People really wanted to find this. So using a label that had this content, it had purpose to have this content labeled this way, was really important. Trans folks could search for this and find out, can I stay in the Army? Am I gonna lose my service? Am I gonna get dishonorably discharged? All of that content is here, and it is important to have that label in this case. So, yep, these are the things that we recommended to National Center of Transgender Equality for their website. They never responded. So just to wrap it up, it's important to, when you're doing research and trying to make your websites inclusive, to work with members of the communities that you want to reach. This isn't just making sure that you're reaching out to them when you're doing your research, but make sure that your teams are diverse to begin with. Avoid stigmatizing language and labeling, because it will immediately turn people away if you don't have language that speaks to them. Avoid unnecessary descriptors when possible, when necessary, because they're unnecessary and they will kind of send people in another section. And finally, ensure that your recruitment and outreach tools are inclusive, because if you don't have inclusive surveys, you're not getting a full look at your audience. If you have a gender selection that just has male, female, and other, there's a whole bunch of people that are looking at that survey and not finishing it, so you're not getting accurate results. And that is me. Yep.
In the back.
I kept hearing, like, when you were moderating, people were addressing your feelings in this. How do you go to work around that?
That's a good question. It's been a while since I did this research. I feel like a lot of the times I was like, I really appreciate what you're saying right now, but that's not important at this moment. Just tell me what you think. Just trying to find a way to like redirect the conversation or like steer the research back to what we're actually doing rather than my feelings. It's kind of what I did. Like, oh, that's really great. I appreciate that. What do you think about this thing?
I don't have a question. I just wanted to just commend you. This was a great presentation, and it's kind of like something that I would like to do for just disability as a whole, just because I think it's a social construct that needs changing, and I want to be a part of that. So I'm super appreciative for this presentation. I just think that it's well done. So yeah, good job.
Thank you.
All right, one last question, and then we do have an end time at 8 sharp.
Hi, I was wondering if you have a favorite story or experience from your journey doing all of this.
Oh boy. I don't remember because I did this research so long ago, but I mean, if you're talking about the experience of like even giving this talk, I gave it for the first time at the Information Architecture Conference in March, and after I finished, one of the people didn't come up to ask a question, but just said that they never saw themselves represented in a conference, and the fact that I had a gusto to stand up and be an open trans person in front of a bunch of strangers, they felt like they now had the chance to do that themselves. And that was just like something I never expected. It was really cool.